Her eyes were supposed to be solid obsidian, endless, unreadable pools of volcanic glass that gave away absolutely nothing. But right now, in the dim emergency lighting of her private suite, they were broken. That was the only word for it. The deep black of Empress Vespera's irises had shattered into 1,000 kaleidoscope shards, shifting and tumbling in a geometric panic. It was a phenomenon the Sylph called fracturing, a physiological betrayal of inner chaos that no amount of royal training could suppress. Usually, I only saw it when her council pushed her too far on trade tariffs. I had never seen it like this. I stood across the room, trying very hard to look like the unbothered, lethal instrument of violence I was being paid to impersonate, and I wiped the blade of my vibro knife on a piece of silk drapery that probably cost more than my entire childhood home. I wanted to look cool. I wanted to look like this was just another Tuesday. But my hands wouldn't cooperate. They were shaking. Not a subtle tremor, but a distinct, rhythmic rattle that traveled up my wrists and made the armor plating on my forearms click softly against itself. The adrenaline dump was hitting me like a freight train. I had just moved faster than I thought possible, done things that were messy and loud and decidedly unrefined, and now that the noise had stopped, my nervous system was filing a formal complaint. I tried to hide it, jamming my hands behind my back, but Vespera's fractured gaze had already locked onto them. The geometric spinning in her eyes slowed. The shards began to knit back together, smoothing into that deep, endless black. She wasn't looking at the intruder crumpled by the door. She was looking at my shaking hands. Truth is, 48 hours ago, I wasn't fighting for anyone's life. I was just a very expensive prop. The contract had been absurd from the start. I was sitting in the recruitment office on the Vanguard, a private contractor with a decent record and a lot of debt, when the Empress's personal steward floated in. They didn't want a bodyguard, they explained. They wanted a statement. The Sylph Dominion is a society built on elegance, sharp lines, and sharper politics. But Vespera was losing her grip on the High Council. She needed to project raw, unrefined strength. She needed a War-Consort. I remember laughing when they told me the title. It sounded like something out of a bad holonovel. You want me to marry her? I had asked, choking on my coffee. The steward had looked at me with profound disdain. Do not be ridiculous, Specialist Thorne. It is ceremonial. You are to be aesthetic intimidation. The Empress requires a symbol of brute force, a creature that implies she has tamed a monster. You are the monster. Triple hazard pay. That was the magic phrase that made me shut up and sign the datapad. For the last 2 days, my job had been to stand behind the crystal throne, wearing 40 pounds of matte black shock armor and scowl at dignitaries. It was mind-numbing work. The throne room was a cavern of acoustic glass and floating lights, smelling faintly of ozone and crushed mint. I felt like an oversized piece of furniture. Vespera would sit there, regal and impossibly tall, her silver skin catching the light. And whenever a rival househead got too aggressive, she would reach back. Her hand, cool and dry, would rest on my armored forearm. It was the signal, the leash gesture. The court would go quiet. They would look at me, the human encased in composite plating, the barbarian from the void. And then they would look at her hand resting casually on my arm, as if holding back a rabid animal. It was all theater. Under the helmet, I was usually counting ceiling tiles or wondering if the mess hall was serving reconstituted lasagna again. I wasn't a monster. I was just a guy named Eris who was good at looking grumpy and needed the credits. But the touch was real. Even through the armor, I could feel the weight of her hand. It was grounded, certain, or at least I thought it was. Tonight there was no armor, just me, her, and in the aftermath of a very bad 10 seconds. I cleared my throat, the sound harsh in the quiet room. My hands were still twitching behind my back. Sorry about the rug, Your Highness, I managed to say, nodding toward the mess by the door. It really tied the room together. Vespera didn't blink. She took a step toward me, her robes rustling like dry leaves. She didn't look like an empress who had tamed a monster anymore. She looked like someone who had just realized the monster was scared. Your hands, she said, her voice dropping to a register I hadn't heard before. It wasn't the booming, projected tone she used for the council. It was quiet, curious, and terrifyingly intimate. They are vibrating. I tried to laugh it off, a ragged sound that scraped against my throat. Just a glitch, Your Majesty. Adrenaline dump. It's, it's a biological cooling system, and I'll be back to standard brooding silence in a minute. She didn't wait for the minute. She reached out, and for the first time since I signed that ridiculous contract, she didn't aim for my armored forearm. She bypassed the composite plating entirely. Her cool, slender fingers wrapped around my bare wrist, right where the pulse was hammering away like a panicked bird against a cage. The contact was electric, not in a romantic novel way, but in a grounding way, like grabbing a live wire and finding out it's actually the only solid thing in the universe. Why? She asked, and she wasn't asking about the vibration. She was looking at the intruder, then back at me. You neutralized the threat with extreme efficiency. You were not hesitant, yet now you shake. The data wafers said humans are a dull species, that you lack the sensory range to feel true terror. I looked down at her hand on my wrist. Her skin was so pale it was almost luminous, a stark contrast to the grease and grime on my own skin. The data wafers are wrong, I said quietly. We feel it. We just do it anyway. That's the job. Vespera went very still. She pulled my hand from behind my back, holding it up between us. My fingers were still twitching, betraying me with every spasm. It was humiliating. I was supposed to be the War-Consort, the brute force, the unshakable rock upon which her enemies would break. Instead, I was just a guy coming down from a chemical high, terrified that I had almost let her get hurt. I expected her to pull away. I expected the disdain, the disappointment that her monster was defective. Instead, the last fracture in her eyes sealed shut. The kaleidoscope geometry vanished, leaving only that deep, endless, restful black. You are not a monster, she whispered, and her thumb brushed over my knuckles, slow and deliberate. A monster does not fear. A monster destroys because it is hungry. You destroyed because you were afraid for me. The air in the room seemed to shift. The smell of ozone faded, replaced by something softer. The faint, dry scent of the expensive incense she burned, and the metallic tang of my own nerves settling down. I'm sorry, I said, feeling the need to apologize for ruining the illusion. I know you paid for a brute. I paid for a prop, she corrected, her gaze lifting to meet mine. I paid for a scarecrow to frighten the crows in the council. But a scarecrow does not bleed for the field it guards. She stepped closer, invading the personal space I had been rigidly maintaining for weeks. She was tall, almost eye level with me, and for the first time, she didn't look like a statue. She looked tired. She looked like a woman who had been holding up the sky for too long and had just found a pillar she didn't have to pretend to lean on. The shaking in my hands began to subside, replaced by a strange, heavy warmth radiating from where she held me. It was the leash gesture, but inverted. She wasn't holding me back anymore. She was holding on. Cancel the theater, heiress, she said. It was the first time she had used my name. I blinked. Your Highness? She released my hand, but she didn't step back. She turned toward the door, where her guards were finally starting to pound on the lock, shouting protocols in panic. She smoothed her robes, her face composing itself into the mask of the Empress, but she glanced back at me with a softness that felt like a secret. When they enter, do not stand behind the throne, she said. Stand beside it. But the contract, I stammered. The aesthetic. The brute. She cut me off with the faintest ghost of a smile. I do not need a brute. I have thousands of soldiers who can follow orders without flinching, but I do not have anyone else who will shake because they value my life. The door hissed open. The royal guard stormed in, weapons raised, scanning for threats. They saw the intruder down. They saw me standing there, no longer in my designated spot in the shadows, but right next to the Empress. Vespera raised a hand, silencing the chaos. The threat is contained, she announced, her voice ringing with absolute, unfractured authority. My consort has handled it. She didn't look at me, but her hand drifted down, her fingers brushing against my unarmored palm for just a second, a hidden promise in the middle of the crowded room. My hands weren't shaking anymore. In fact, as I took my place beside her, I felt steadier than I had in my entire life. I was definitely going to have to renegotiate my contract. So the fake dating trope is a classic, but why does it work so well when you add a life or death situation? In the case of Eris and Empress Vespera, we aren't just looking at romance, we are looking at trauma response architecture. First, we see a distinct variation of the Ben Franklin effect. In human psychology, we tend to like people more after we do a favor for them, because our brain has to justify why we spent the effort. Here, the Vespera does the ultimate favor. She entrusts Eris with her life. By placing her safety entirely in his hands, her brain has to reconcile that decision. It says, I trust him with my existence. Therefore, he must be incredibly valuable to me. She cognitive dissonances her way into affection. She invested trust, and the return on investment was love. This is the crucial turning point. Both characters are professional liars. He is paid to play the mindless brute. She is trained to play the unflappable god queen. Usually intimacy is built slowly, but when the assassin strikes, both masks drop at the exact same second. She sees him shaking. He isn't a brute. And he sees her eyes fracture. She isn't a god. This is simultaneous mask collapse. When you see someone's raw, terrified reality while they are looking at yours, yes, it creates an instant, secret world that only the two of you inhabit. Finally, we have hypervigilance bonding, often called foxhole friendship. In high-threat environments, your brain is flooded with cortisol. When you identify a specific person who alleviates that threat, who makes the cortisol go down, your brain rewires to associate that person with safety. Vespera's world is full of political sharks. Eris didn't just kill the assassin. He became the only person in the room who didn't want something from her. He just wanted her to be okay. In a palace of transactions, that kind of protective altruism is the most addictive drug there is.